Welcome back, everyone. In this lesson, I'll show you how to label polygon and line data in ArcGIS. While labeling is a large topic that we could easily spend a whole week on, I'm going to show you the basics of labeling, but also a few specialized features such as label expressions, which allow you to modify the text of your labels, as well as label classes, which allow you to label different features in the same feature class in different ways based on attributes. To kick this off, let's just start by labeling the counties here. So the easiest way to do this is I'll right click on them and I'll select label features as we did once before. And it's going to take it a moment. You'll see it refresh and it'll say labeling left corner. And then just going to use a simple font and black text and put the county names on top of each county feature. As we said before, it pulls these names from the attribute table, and it's smart enough to try to find fields with names like name. So it knows that you're trying to name things when you're labeling them usually. So it looks for fields that are named name. Naturally, you might not always want the field called name to be the label field, so you can change that where we change all the rest of the labeling information. We can go to the properties pane, you probably guessed it by now, and go to the label pane, and it takes a little bit to populate sometimes. It's a pretty basic interface that initially draws my attention right here, but we'll get some more options once we start changing some of the selections here. The big thing to note is that this checkbox here can turn on and off the labeling, just like when we right clicked on the layer in the table of contents. And right down here is that field name it guessed. So the label field comes from name here, and it selected that for us automatically, as I said before. But if your labels were in a different field in your attribute table, you could select any field in this drop-down list to be the labels. Even if it gets our field name right, we might want to change how it displays. I might want to inform people that these are counties because it's not initially obvious necessarily that these are county features. So to do that, I'll change the label expression. I'll click here for expression, and it immediately populates the expression with the field name for me here, and it's bracketed because that's the format in this particular case. And what I can do is write in some additional text in order to have it display differently. What I'll do first is I'm going to change the parser because VBScript is going out in ArcGIS and Python is becoming much more pervasive throughout the system. So I'll click Python, and that'll be a little bit of an easier syntax for me to show you. And what we do when we want to add additional text to existing text here, which that's what that'll populate as, we'll click, or we'll put a space and then I'll put a plus sign and I'll put another space and I'll add a quote because I'm going to add more text, and then space and then county. And what that's going to do is it's going to evaluate this expression here for every record in the attribute table and come up with a label based on it. And so it'll pull the name field from the attribute table, and it's going to append, using the plus sign, a space and the word county to it when it creates the label. So I can verify it right now, and it says the expression is valid and gives me an example of the text and an example of the label to verify that I did it right the way I wanted to. Click OK to close that out, and click OK to close this out, and click apply. And then it takes a moment to label, and I'll see that, yeah, it now says Mendocino County over here and Sonoma County over here. So that's great. I'm going to close this out temporarily so that we can turn off a few of these layers, make it a little easier for you to see everything. And then let's go back in and change how this label looks. And we do that in this text symbol area over here. And I can select the font or the font size and the color right here. But in this case, I'm going to use a pre-built one in the symbol palette. And it'll take that just a moment to populate and pop up. And I'm going to select the country 2 option. I think this one can be pretty good when you're trying to show regions and have them kind of fade to the background because it's a grayer label and then it has a little bit of a shadow. In this case, I'm going to make it a little smaller to convey that they're less important than a country on my map. So I'll click OK. I'll click apply just to see if I like it. I still think those labels are a little big, but now I can edit it from right here. So I'll make them size 8, click apply, and that's much more what I'm looking for. One thing I'll point out right here, even though I like the aesthetic look of this as it is right now, I should note that for older viewers or people who have impaired vision in any way, this could be problematic because with the gray on gray here, the contrast is a little low, and people with impaired vision can sometimes have difficulty seeing it. So if I'm trying to make a broadly accessible, publicly available map, I'd probably want to make these labels a little darker, or alternatively change the background color of the counties so that the labels stand out a bit more. for now, since we're really working on technique and not on these individual labels, let's move on. So we're done with counties, and let's turn on primary and secondary roads. And this adds a whole lot of clutter to our map at the moment. So to label this for now, let's zoom into the Sacramento area here so that we can see these roads a little better, but this is an area with a lot going on. And I'll start by doing the same thing I did before. I'm just gonna turn on label features and see what it gives me. Okay, it gives me something kind of okay, but this is really cluttered in here. So let's try to clean this up a bit. The first thing I might do in a situation like this is say, well, I don't think all of these need to be labeled. I really only want the most important ones of these labeled. And that's what I can do with label classes. So if I go into properties, and then I'll be on the labeling tab as before, the option up here that I will select under method, by default, it says label all the features the same way, but we don't want to do that. We're going to label the features differently. So I'll select define classes of features and label each class differently. So I can group my features into different groups based upon attributes and choose label types for each. So some new stuff popped up here. And by default, it just gives me one class, one group called default. And by default, it labels features in that class. But I can add a new class and I'll call it do not label. And for each of these classes, I select the dropdown and then I can define a SQL query that defines what features are members of that class and receive those options. And remember, a SQL query is just a query against our attribute table. We write those when we work with select by attributes. So let's start by defining the labels that we want to display. So I'll click SQL query, and these attributes probably won't mean much to you, but I know that I want to distinguish them by the field MTFCC here. And I'll click get unique values. I'll click equals, and the important labels that I wanted to display, the higher priority roads are S1100 here. So I'll click that and I'll click OK and click apply. And notice that nothing changed. And that's because we haven't disabled any labels yet. We've just made everything labeled still. So now I'm going to switch to the do not label class and I'll create a new SQL query here. So I'll bring that up and I'll bring up the same field again and put the equals and again get unique values. And this time I'll choose the other value in the field, the S1200, and those are lower priority. So I'll click OK. And critically, now I need to turn off labeling for this class by clicking label features in this class. So it's unchecked. And now I'll click apply. And what comes up is far fewer labels. These are the major highways only, and all the other roads here aren't getting labeled because they were in that lower priority class that we just unchecked the label features in this class option for. This isn't the only option that you can do when you have label classes. You can change the label expression per class, and you can also change the symbol and the placement properties per class here. So everything in this class box is affected by the label class. So you have a lot of options for how to handle your labels when you can divide them up and then set all these other options related to the classes. Okay, so now let's switch from roads to rivers. And just to keep the clutter down, I'll turn off roads and I'll turn on rivers. And again, let's right click and click label features. And these are just going every which way. It's hard to tell which one of these is Magpie Creek and where Arcade Creek becomes Cripple Creek here. Lots of these are nearly unreadable or too close together or at weird angles. So let's change our label styling in order to address these issues. So we'll go to the label pane. And once it comes up, we'll select placement properties. And on the placement tab, let's start by making them curved, which is a little more intuitive for rivers. We're used to that. And I'll click OK really quickly and click apply. And we can see that it moves these along the shape of the river as much as it can. It kind of curves and bends them to match along the feature. But it doesn't do it exactly because that'd probably be even more confusing if it was really touching all these lines. Now let's select a more appropriate set of colors for this. I'm going to use the symbol pane again and use a predefined one that is meant for rivers. And if I scroll down here, I'll see the river option here. And I'll click apply. And that's getting even better here. So we have smaller labels, much more typical river style in being serif font and curving along the rivers here. Still, if you notice, some of these, especially where they overlap other rivers here, like Alder Creek, are a little hard to read. So let's change the symbol even more to address this. And what we're going to do is we're going to put a color behind the label so that when it overlaps features, you can still read the label. So I can do more than just what's right here when I click Edit Symbol. It'll bring up a whole new pane with a lot of advanced options for symbols. And you can do this in lots of different places throughout the application. And what I'll do is I'm going to skip all these options here. I'm going to go straight over to the mask option, and I'm going to select Halo. And the size of 1 is good here. And you could see, maybe you can't see it in the video, but there's a white background here. But in this case, I don't want white because I think it'll be a little jarring. I want it to be more like the gray of the counties in the background. So I'll click Symbol again, and I'll change the fill color of the halo to just a light gray here. That might even be a little dark. So I'll select a lighter gray, click OK. And now you can see a little bit of a dark gray background here. So I'll click OK again, and then OK again, and click Apply. And you can see that there's a halo in gray behind my rivers labels here, and they're easy to read even when they cross other rivers. So let's click OK out of here just so we can see everything and see how we're doing with our general clutter. Overall, we're doing okay, but let's go take a look at some other options that we have for placement of these labels. Back to the labels palette. And under placement properties, where I selected curved, we can select some other options here, such as removing duplicate labels or placing above or below the line. But the other thing we can do is we can do some conflict detection here. So if we had the roads up with lots of labels and a lot of other features up with lots of labels, we might want to really work on these options here. And we don't have enough time to do it in this video, but I encourage you to play with it, and they have good instructions here. The big thing is we can set how high of a precedence the labels have versus the features. Should they overlap features in this layer or any other layer? And if they're high priority, then yes, they can overlap features. But if we set them to a low priority, we can then set features to higher priority so that the labels can't overlap them. As a quick demonstration, let's just swap these. So I'm going to set the feature weight here to high and the label weight to low. And let's look at what happens when we do that. Click OK, click OK again. And we lost all the labels that were overlapping rivers, but it really cleaned some of the stuff up. We also got labels that moved below their river as well. But the consequence of that is that fewer features are labeled now. Overall though, I think that this is a cleaner map for the labeling options we just set. I should mention that these are relatively simple labeling options in this labeling engine. ArcGIS has another labeling engine called Maplex, which is really beloved by cartographers because it's super powerful and lets you pack tons and tons of labels into a really dense map. It's amazing how much information you can get on a map once you're using a really powerful labeling engine like Maplex. We don't have time to cover it in this course, and it's probably a little advanced, but we are going to cover using Maplex in a later course in this specialization. So if you're going to continue on with us, you'll learn how to use that then. So that's it for this lesson. In this lesson, I showed you how to do basic labeling of features, how to use label expressions to change the wording of your labels, how to use label classes to segment your features into different groups for different types of labels, and how to use label placement options to define how your labels are placed relative to the features they're labeling. Labeling is one of those mundane topics that can also be really interesting and fun when you get into it. It's kind of a challenge to try to get more information onto your map with it. I really enjoy it sometimes, and other times it's really frustrating, and I think you might find it to be pretty similar depending upon what you're interested in. I encourage you to give it a try with some of your own maps and see what you can do. The next lesson is the final lesson in our cartography series, and it's going to cover how to make simple map books, which lets you divide your map into pieces and zoom into them to get more detail across multiple pages of a map export. It's a really useful technique. It's really easy, and I think you'll find some uses for it in your own work. See you there.